This is part two of my response to the Thirlwall lawyers and Times article regarding comments made on baby A or child A from the Lucy Letby case. In the previous part, we looked at the background to this infant and the medical and clinical picture surrounding the child. I'm going to begin this second part by just going over a few details, but Lucy Letby, as can be seen here, was found guilty of causing the death of this infant via the deliberate injection of air into his bloodstream. The first thing that I wanted to discuss was this, which is a comment that I made in the previous video. I just wanted to correct that. So, the mother of twins, child A and child B, had actually wanted this infant to be born outside of Chester, and was very upset when this was apparently deemed to be too risky. It was actually an infant that was deemed to be acceptable to be born in Chester. There are other children in the case that literally weren't allowed to be born there, but for some reason it was okay for them to be transferred there to be cared for at the County Chester, which seems a trifle odd, shall we say. So I said in the previous video that the infant was transferred, which is not correct. What is correct is that the mother wanted the infant to be born at a tertiary unit because essentially I think she believed, with some justification, that this hospital wasn't up to it. Unfortunately, the child died shortly afterwards and pretty much vindicated her view, and I'm sure she, in normal circumstances, and I'm sure prior to being contacted by the police, she was very bitter about that and would have felt very angered about what had occurred. Unfortunately, in my view, she's been misled quite significantly since then. So I just wanted to clarify that firstly. I also wanted to make a comment and just clarify something that someone has made a comment about in the previous video. So they've said here just a little detailed nitpick on one thing you said, where you mentioned that Evans turned around the evidence of the rash to point to air embolism, but you then say much more likely that the rash was caused by other conditions. I think it's fair to say that it's now been established that there is no possibility at all of any of the reported so-called rashes being due to venous air embolism. Professor Lee has clarified in recent new evidence that such a link has never ever been seen and is considered theoretically almost impossible. So in the context of the method of murder proposed by the prosecution, it is a non-starter. So it's not about it being merely much more likely, it's a case of the so-called rash or skin discoloration effects being of no relevance. It cannot be considered to be evidence of any air entering the venous system from whatever cause. So in my response, I kind of explained to this person that when I'm speaking off the top of my head, as I've said here, I'm erring on the side of caution and trying to avoid hyperbole. I could always make stronger claims than are even included in these videos, but I don't want to exaggerate or be guilty of being melodramatic. I feel the case is strong enough anyway. Our case that this is an unsafe conviction, that Lucy is innocent, is already very strong. I don't need to make claims that could be criticised or that can't be backed up factually. So of course, a lot of the time, I've made notes, I've made preparations, and I'm speaking with prepared material and information. But also, there's a lot of speaking off the top of my head during these videos. And when I do speak off the top of my head, I'm always going to try to be cautious. I'm always going to try to be factual. I'm always going to lean towards making less severe claims because I feel that strengthens our case rather than making extreme claims that either can't be backed up or that can be criticised or that can be seen as partisan, to use Dr. Evans' word. However, in this instance, the person that's posted here is, of course, absolutely correct. And you can say quite legitimately that the notion of this rash being caused by venous air embolism has been categorically discounted. So when I say it's more likely, I could have said it's completely discounted and it just simply wasn't caused by that. And I think that's a fair comment and a fair observation. I just wanted to kind of explain my outlook and my mentality going into these videos and the approach that I attempt to make. I did mention in my comment here that there's another quite well-known YouTube channel that has been very heavily weighted towards guilt. And I'm not here to bash that person, but they have definitely not taken my approach. They've been guilty of a lot of hyperbole, and I just don't want to do that when it's not necessary, given that we have such a strong case and such strong evidence in favour of Lucy's innocence and this being an unsafe conviction and an egregious miscarriage of justice. So I'll always err on the side of caution, but on this occasion, this person is absolutely correct that I could have made the case stronger than I did, but there was a reason for that. The next thing I'd like to discuss, so in the previous video I went over the 18 deaths on this neonatal unit. They're not all listed here in this document, but many of them are listed. But I didn't point out something that I just wanted to point out quickly. So for these two non-indictment babies here, we see some details about them. I don't think we'll ever have the full clinical picture for these infants because I assume they're confidential. I assume their medical details are confidential, and therefore we can't know everything about them. But there's a couple of things. Something else has just occurred to me now, really, which is that in the case, Lucy Letby was criticised because infants passed away overnight while she was on duty. So what do you notice here? This infant passed away at 5:16 a.m. This one, I don't know if that would be categorised as overnight, but it's certainly not in the afternoon. It's early morning. We see for this one, 5:16, it's earlier than this infant passing away 5:58 a.m. Also, when this infant passed away in the evening. So some of these infants passed away in the morning. These two did. And then later we have them passing away in the afternoon and early evening. But we see with these other infants, this one's passing away at 5 in the morning. This one's at 8 o'clock as well. So the majority of these infants are passing away. Now, I have dealt with this in the book. It is known to be the case that infants are vulnerable at this time of day. Someone, I think a neonatal nurse told me it's sometimes the early hours of the morning are described as the witching hour by nurses because it's when things can go wrong. And then I also found a study which indicates that it's known that statistically infants are more likely to die, young babies are more likely to die in the early hours of the morning than at any other time of the day. And there are known scientific reasons for this. However, that wasn't actually initially what I wanted to point out. I just thought I'd point out things I just noticed that as well. What I wanted to point out was that for these two infants here, this one here and this one here, their birth gestation was 40 weeks and 39 weeks. That also applies to this infant here that was born at 40 weeks. Now, these are all full-term babies. I believe the full term of pregnancies deemed to be between 38 and 42 weeks, or maybe 37 and 42 weeks. But 40 weeks is absolutely supposed to be the normal period of gestation. 39 is not a premature baby, not at all. So even in the case of child D, there was some comments that, child D wasn't even a particularly premature infant, which is a fair comment. 37 weeks is very close to being a full-termer. It may actually officially be deemed a full-termer. Of course, the child was born with chronic pneumonia and acute lung injury and had an absolute catalogue of health problems, and they made loads of mistakes. However, the point is that this infant is 40 weeks, this infant is 39 weeks, and this infant is 40 weeks. They're not even premature, and they still passed away. It's just that Dr. Evans decided that we don't need to worry about those cases. And actually, there are some non-indictment babies that are very premature here, 28 weeks, 30 weeks, and 29 weeks. But the most premature infants in the case were those that were included in the court case. The most premature infants that we see discussed on the unit over this period were involved in the court case. Now, ironically, they're not on this list because child G didn't pass away, as we discussed in the previous video, and child K, which should never be part of any court case because the allegations related to child K can only be described as farcical. That infant didn't pass away in the cancer Chester. That infant passed away in Harrow Park Hospital. but they were the two most premature by some distance, being born at 23 weeks and 25 weeks. Whereas you see these two infants born 4 months later than these two infants that the first one survived, the second one passed away on a different unit. But it really goes to show that simply prematurity in itself, or simply being born as a full-term infant, does not guarantee survival. It does not it doesn't guarantee health. There are no guaranteed outcomes with any infant. Even the healthiest child can collapse relatively suddenly and can die. And even then, as we discussed in the previous video, the reasons for this and a proper explanation for this can never be uncovered. Now, in this case, reasons have been given. I have no way of knowing whether those reasons are accurate. I have no reason to disbelieve them. But these are full-term infants that passed away on the neonatal unit. They were just deemed to be unsuspicious. Whereas, you see comments relate to these other infants that were born, 9 weeks, 10 weeks, 11 weeks early, and Dr. Evans in court is saying, they were doing perfectly fine. They weren't even particularly premature, etc., and all these other comments. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that we know for a fact infants died in this neonatal unit at the same time period that were full-termers, essentially. So when you're getting these very vulnerable infants that are premature, that are low birth weight, of course they can pass away. I mean, that's obvious anyway, but this just underlines that point further still. Something else I wanted to mention, the final thing before we go into the kind of core subject of this video, is this MBRRACE-UK. Surely one of the worst acronyms that's ever been created. Mothers and Babies Reducing Risk Through Audits and Confidential Inquiries Across the UK. I can't help think they could have come up with a snappier title. But it's a very important organisation that its role is conducting robust national surveillance and investigating the deaths of women and babies who die during pregnancy or shortly after pregnancy in the UK. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning this organisation is that the Cancer Chester was one of 21 hospitals that was referred to this organisation in 2015 for subpar performance with regard to neonatal deaths. And I have the 2015 report from this organisation here. They don't break down the deaths into individual hospitals, but they do break them down into areas. So I'm just going to scroll down and show you, this is table 6 here, crude and stabilised and adjusted stillbirth, neonatal and extended perinatal mortality rates by clinical commissioning group, etc., etc., etc. So the lowest number and lowest figure, so this is the crude neonatal deaths per 1,000 births. The smallest figure of an English region, unfortunately they're not split up for hospitals, they're only broken down into regions, but the lowest number for a region was Barnet with 0.76. I've looked through the whole list. And the lowest number for Scotland is Grampian with 0.62. Now, ironically, just scroll up a little bit further, the biggest number in England was for Herefordshire, where Lucy grew up. Obviously, she wasn't working there, she was working in Cheshire, but this was 4.61. You can see Herefordshire right next to Havering there, who's on 0.91. So there is literally a 7-fold fluctuation between the performance of Herefordshire and the performance of Grampian, and about 6.5 times between Herefordshire and Barnet. And then all the way through you see big fluctuations. Just here you see Hull is over 3.5 times more than Hounslow, and you see that all the way through the document. I'm just going to scroll up and show you some examples. That's perinatal mortality rates. Here we are, neonatal mortality rates. So here's a map of the UK, and you can see green is essentially good, yellow is okay, orange is not great, and red is bad. And you can see the very different outcomes. Lots of greens, lots of yellows, lots of orange or ambers, and lots of reds, because the performance of these areas and regions was very different. You can see even within London, you've got one red, quite a few ambers, quite a few yellows, and quite a few greens. I think here Birmingham and the Black Country is being highlighted as a particularly poorly performing region, perhaps. That's why it's there, because there's a lot of red. And there isn't, the point is, there isn't stability. You can't just look at a neonatal unit, the performance of a hospital, or the performance of a region, and expect it to be stable. It's going to fluctuate. It does fluctuate, and they do fluctuate, particularly across a system such as this, which is an enormous data set with a vast amount of data. And that's before you go into the second important point, which you have to take circumstances into consideration. You can't just say, this number is higher than we were expecting. Wow, that's really worrying. Of course, there are contextual reasons why the numbers can fluctuate. They don't just fluctuate for no reason. They fluctuate for underlying causes. Everything in the universe is cause and effect. You just need to understand the cause. You just need to understand the cause to find the effect, and to properly understand the effect. So when you see these kind of fluctuations, it's not surprising. And Chester was not alone. As I said, there were 20 other hospitals that were referred to this organisation for subpar performance. Now, there was no criminal investigations into any of the other 20 hospitals. And you can see there's organisations and regions all over the country. From the tip of Scotland is more than 10% higher than the UK average, and right down here, the southmost point of England is up to 10% higher than the UK average, with every performance metric in between. And I'm sure next year that region could have performed really well, and this region could have performed really well, and that one might have performed really badly. We just don't know. And just because it did perform badly, that doesn't mean anything. Obviously, clearly, it doesn't mean anything sinister went on, but it doesn't even mean the hospital failed or the hospitals in the region failed. There can be contextual reasons, and also sometimes it's just bad luck. There are random aspects to the universe. There are random aspects to everything that happens. It's kind of like I always watch sport, and there'll be a result. I don't know. A team will play well in one game, and they won't play well in the next game. And everyone wants to understand why, and everyone wants to. It's just one of those things. It's just luck. Just sometimes you turn up and play well, and sometimes you turn up and play badly. Sometimes, you try your best on a neonatal unit and you perform really well. Sometimes you try your best and things go wrong. Sometimes a baby just collapses and no one knows why, because of the very high percentage of unexplained deaths. So it's really, really important to highlight that, because again, this is not explained in court, not contextualized. The jury don't know it. The jury don't understand it. They were, in my view, very significantly misled by the way that things were conveyed to them in terms of the condition of the babies. But actually, neonatal units do fluctuate in performance. It's normal for them to fluctuate in performance. Why wouldn't they, considering they're dealing with very vulnerable infants, premature infants that in some cases are literally expected not to survive? So I just wanted to go over those points before we begin this video. I realised that took 20 minutes, but some of these things do take a little bit of explanation and commentary. I'm now going to get into the main part of the video, which is responding to the comments from the Times article and the Thirlwall families. So now we're going to move on to the central contention of this Times article related to child A, which is this assertion that the panel have ignored evidence given at trial by Professor Sally Kinsey, a consultant haematologist, who confirmed that the child had not inherited his mother's clotting disorder. This was accepted by the defence at the original trial. Professor Sally Kinsey made some remarks that the infants definitely were not suffering with this condition that we'll go on to discuss. It's quite strange that she said that, because her assertions were quite flawed. I suppose it is essentially true that this was accepted by the defence at the original trial. That may be a procedural issue, I don't know, but numerous things were accepted by the defence that were incorrect. It's really not my place or business to address that. I know there's this issue of you could have brought that up at the first trial. I mean, I would hope eventually that the Court of Appeal will not rely on that when all of the evidence from the case has collapsed and been demolished, and the whole prosecution case has disintegrated. And if there's enough public pressure, I would hope that they can't rely on that argument of, well, you could have said this at the time, so Lucy Letby has to stay in prison indefinitely. I think public pressure is critical to that process. However, I'll move on to discussing the actual condition that is referenced here, although not named, which I've discussed in a previous video. It's antiphospholipid syndrome. This is a disorder of the immune system that causes an increased risk of blood clots. It means that people with antiphospholipid syndrome are at greater risk of developing conditions such as deep vein thrombosis, arterial thrombosis, or blood clots in the brain. In this case, it's more thrombosis that is relevant. There's some further information here about the syndrome. Notably, it says here that antiphospholipid syndrome doesn't always cause noticeable problems. It's not always noticed. The symptoms are not always immediately obvious, so it can be difficult to detect. So the interesting aspect of this is that medical notes from the time indicate that both child A and child B, which were twins born to the same mother, were both born with antiphospholipid syndrome. So you can see here, this is a record from the Chester Standard. And it just simply states that the child A, a baby boy, was born with antiphospholipid syndrome. We see in a later discussion that child B was born with antiphospholipid syndrome as well. Even though we're not dealing with child B in this video, this was included in medical notes at the time. So, as mentioned, this is an autoimmune disorder which leads to increased risk of blood clotting, but this is also enhanced by various aspects of the treatment of child A that were pointed out to me by various people that I've spoken with. We've seen in this case that there's been 7 catheterizations. Now, this is problematical. It causes complications, so many repeat catheterizations, and it renders the whole the infant more vulnerable, and it's more likely that this antiphospholipid syndrome is going to cause problems. The same for trauma, which can be related to catheterizations, that was also present, and sepsis, which we're going to go on to discuss, and that was yet again present in this infant. It's very difficult to understand why this syndrome has been included in clinical notes from the time, and yet it's somehow been discounted in court. There isn't a lot of sense in that, really. And I spoke to paediatricians and other medics, and they essentially said to me that the impact of antiphospholipid syndrome wasn't properly explored during the trial. It can affect an infant, especially when these other factors are involved that have been mentioned here, and that it's quite likely that antibodies from the mother affected the infants. When this is coupled with poor treatment, it can have a big impact on children in these sort of circumstances. So I just mentioned the antibodies there, and I've asked this question here just to illustrate this. Again, this isn't something that I pulled out of my own brain. This is something I was told by people that know a lot more than me, that antibodies can be passed on without the symptoms of antiphospholipid syndrome being present, and without the syndrome being detected in children. So I've asked this question, and it says yes, antiphospholipid antibodies such as lupus, anticoagulant, anti-cardiolpin antibodies, and anti-beta-2 glycoprotein antibodies can be passed from a mother with antiphospholipid syndrome to her infant through the placenta, but this does not necessarily mean that the infant will have antiphospholipid syndrome, but it can still affect them. So I was also told by someone who's very knowledgeable on this subject that this occurs approximately 30% of the time, which was confirmed here. Antiphospholipid antibodies associated with the syndrome can be passed from mother to infant, but only temporarily in about 30% of cases. So this can easily occur, particularly with twins. There is a study here. This is a study, Laboratory and Clinical Features of Pregnant Women with Antiphospholipid Syndrome and Neonatal Outcome. And this just concludes that there seems to be more than one kind of pregnant woman with antiphospholipid syndrome, even when treated with a second-line therapy plan, mothers with LAC, which is laboratory and clinical features, I believe, and or triple antiphospholipid positivity and or previous thromboembolism seem to have a high probability of poor neonatal outcome, whereas those with pregnancy and morbidity alone treated with conventional drugs seem to have a high probability of favourable outcome. This is very important because thromboembolism has ultimately been part of the diagnosis that has been communicated now by the panel. And there's some further information here on how antiphospholipid syndrome causes thrombosis and thromboembolisms. Thrombosis refers to the formation of blood clots within blood vessels, and in antiphospholipid syndrome, antibodies cause hypercoagulability and increased tendency for blood to clot. This happens through the activation of endothelial cells, making them express procoagulant molecules and reduce anticoagulant ones. This shifts the balance towards clotting. Obviously, that's quite technical. Platelet activation, platelets, just an aspect related to the blood. Antiphospholipid syndrome can directly bind and activate platelets, making them more likely to clump together and form clots. Disruption of anticoagulant mechanisms. Antiphospholipid syndrome interferes with protein C pathway and exin A5 shield, leading to reduced protection against clotting. This is all very technical. Obviously, complement system activation. Some evidence suggests antiphospholipid antibodies activate the complement system, contributing to inflammation and thrombosis. So this is all very technical information, but this was all cited in this tweet by Professor Carola Vinuesa, which is from the 3rd of September 2024. So this is well before the panel get together. It's well before anyone knows anything about this. Professor Vinuesa is talking about they had pathology reports, which we know already. And the one that she's talking here about, the one that didn't have a pathology report with a confirmed cause of death, which is child A. She goes over some of the details that we've discussed and some additional information as well, but she states the mother was known to have antiphospholipid syndrome, an autoimmune disease in which antiphospholipid antibodies can cause preeclampsia, maternal and fetal thrombosis, exactly what we've just been discussing, intrauterine growth retardation and fetal loss, increasing by fourfold the risk of neonatal mortality. So obviously a fourfold increase is quite significant. And we know from the clinical notes at the time that the mother was the child was born with antiphospholipid syndrome. So was child B, as we know here. We know that the mother was showing signs of antiphospholipid syndrome. It's in clinical notes. This was all acknowledged in the pathology reports, in the medical work of the time, and yet somehow this was all turned around in the court case, and it was all thrown out of the window, with Professor Sally Kinsey just stating, "Oh, this is of no relevance. It's not correct." We're going to come on to that further in a minute, but it's another issue among many where something happened in court which seems to be utterly inexplicable. There doesn't seem to be any reasonable explanation for this. It doesn't really stand up to any scrutiny. It's very difficult to understand given that it had already been established in the medical notes by someone that's examined the infants, by someone that's examined them and their condition at the time of death, and then years after the fact. By the time we're in the court case, we're talking about 7 years after the infant passed away, and then we're saying, oh, there's no antiphospholipid syndrome. That's the critical in the insulin cases as well, which I'm going to do a series on in due course. So Professor Vinuesa explains here that maternal antiphospholipid antibodies cross the placenta and can cause thrombosis in neonates, including neonatal stroke, cerebrovascular thrombosis, which is difficult to diagnose clinically in neonates and requires dedicated neuroimaging techniques. So there's a few important points to make here. Firstly, it's difficult to diagnose clinically. So not only does that make it difficult for people working on the infant at the time, which passed away very quickly, but also when the pathology reports are being conducted by Dr. Jane Horden and Dr. Joe McPartland, it's difficult for them to give a definitive diagnosis. That's why they've defined it as unascertained. That doesn't mean that it's suspicious. And a definition, a diagnosis of an unascertained death, an unexplained death, does not inherently mean that it's suspicious. As Professor Vinweiser explains earlier on, somewhere in this post, it's something that I've already stated earlier in the video, but I don't know if she does make it in this post actually. But anyway, oh yeah, no, so here it is. Around 7% of natural neonatal deaths in the UK are unexplained. So I think that's just for all infants. I think it's 7 to 8% for all infants. But anyway, a large percentage of deaths are unexplained, as I've discussed in previous videos. So Professor Vinweiser goes on to say, patent foramen ovale in newborns makes it easier for a venous thromboembolism to bypass pulmonary vasculature and enter the systemic circulation, which may cause a stroke. So all that essentially means is the condition of neonates with regards to ovale means that this condition can more readily occur because it can more readily enter the bloodstream, causing a stroke, causing these problems. Obviously, it's very serious for such vulnerable infants. Antiphospholipid antibodies can also increase the risk of thrombosis from a central venous line or umbilical catheter complication, both of which were inserted in baby A. Of course, as we mentioned, there were multiple catheterizations. Umbilical catheters were misplaced by doctors twice in child A, which also delayed fluid administration. See Rachel Levy's account below. Besides, thrombosis, malposition of umbilical catheters can also lead to cardiac arrhythmias, as we've already discussed as well. Skin discoloration mottling seen in child A is to be expected with arterial or venous thrombosis, as we've also discussed previously. Child A also had crossed pulmonary arteries, as we've also discussed previously, a rare vascular anomaly that is often, in 62% of cases, caused by other underlying genetic diseases with their own cardiovascular complications, including arrhythmias. Now, I should say that Professor Vinweiser is one of the world's most preeminent geneticists, so when she's citing this, she's citing it from a position of really equal expertise. Yet the expert for the prosecution stated that he made his diagnosis of presumed air embolism after ruling out other factors. The point being here that it's impossible to rule out these other factors without adequate testing that we know hasn't occurred. We're going to go into that in more detail. We're going to see what Professor Sally Kinsey said, and we're going to go over the extent to which the diagnosis and the information that's presented in court is fatally, fundamentally flawed. So this is from the New Yorker article by Rachel Levy. A nursing note from the day shift said that the baby had no fluid running for a couple of hours because his umbilical catheter, a tube that delivers fluids through the abdomen, had twice been placed in the wrong position and doctors were busy. A junior doctor eventually put in a long line, a thin tube threaded through a vein, and Letby and another nurse gave the child fluid. 20 minutes later, Letby and a third nurse, a few feet away, noticed that his oxygen levels were dropping and that his skin was mottled. The doctor who had inserted the long line worried that he'd placed it too close to the child's heart, which we've discussed previously, and he immediately took it out. But less than 90 minutes after Letby started her shift, the baby was dead. It was awful, she wrote to a colleague afterward. He died very suddenly and unexpectedly just after handover. So there's a bit of an account here of what Dr. Evans said, which frankly I'm not going to go over because I think we've established already we're going to be discussing more and more what he said, stuff related to embolism, things that were in the court transcripts, more and more exposing the, I would say, semi-farcical accounts that he has provided in court and the equally farcical science and scientific verdicts that have been put into this court case almost entirely thanks to him. So I'm not going to go over that at this point in time. I'm just going to finish this particular section by going over what the panel said, which is that the mother had antiphospholipid syndrome, which is a condition in which the immune system mistakenly creates antibodies that attack tissues in the body. These antibodies can trigger blood clots to form in arteries and veins. During pregnancy, antibodies can pass through the placenta to the neonate and lead to thromboembolism, particularly if there is a concurrent infection, which there was. Post-mortem of baby 1 showed a recent non-occluding thrombus in the liver, which means there was a recent thrombotic event. On the day of collapse, baby 1 had 2 central catheters that were left with infusion for up to 4 hours, which predisposed to thrombosis when there is no infusion. Shortly after infusion was started in the most central line, baby 1 collapsed. A thrombus from the catheter tip likely migrated to an artery supplying to the brainstem, causing sudden collapse and inability to resuscitate the infant. It is also possible that baby 1 had placental fetal vascular malperfusion, in which the fetal villi in the placenta present small thrombi that can travel to and occlude small blood vessels in major organs like the heart, brain, and liver. If a small thrombus lands in the artery supplying a critical structure like the brainstem, it can cause sudden death, and they are very hard to find on post-mortem. Collapse associated with fetal vascular malperfusion can occur 1 to 2 days after birth. So this is all information that's now familiar to us, complicated though it is, because we've gone over all of these things previously, and of course we know in this final comment that collapse associated with it can occur 1 to 2 days after birth. That is, of course, exactly what occurred in the case of child A. So the first thing to say about this is that a diagnosis of antiphospholipid syndrome requires 2 positive blood tests at least 12 weeks apart. There's a bit of an explanation of this here. It's due to the antibodies sometimes being present temporarily due to infections or medications, and to ensure that it's not based on a transient condition. So that applies with regarding to either confirming the condition or ruling it out, but it was certainly present, and it cannot be ruled out unless you've done the 2 blood tests at 12 weeks apart. I could show you many academic papers that confirm this, but instead I'll just simply show you the guidelines from the British Society of Haematology. The diagnosis of APS requires the presence of at least 1 clinical event, either an objectively confirmed thrombotic event and or pregnancy complication, and detection of 1 or more APL on 2 or more occasions at least 12 weeks apart. So essentially, until you've done the blood tests, you can't say for certain one way or another. And we know, I've been over this in previous videos, the quality and standard of testing at this hospital was very poor. Really, they haven't done any of the testing required for any of the infants, including the insulin testing, which I'll get into in future videos. So I've asked this question here: can you rule out antiphospholipid syndrome on the basis of 1 blood test? No, you generally cannot rule out antiphospholipid syndrome on the basis of 1 single blood test. Here's why. APS diagnosis requires clinical criteria, so they don't laboratory criteria. It is almost exactly the same thing as the insulin, where they didn't do laboratory standard testing, they didn't do forensic testing. It's the same with the enterovirus. It's the same with the multifilia ones. I forget what the first word is in that, but it ends in multifilia. I've discussed it previously. They didn't do the testing for that either. So as the laboratory criteria must be repeated at least 12 weeks apart. And then there's mentioned all these things that I've discussed previously earlier in the video. So negative result may miss a fluctuating antibody level or be affected by timing or technical issues. The point is that Sally Kinsey cannot stand up in court and say definitively that the infants didn't have this syndrome, and that's exactly what she did. So moving on to this, when a mother has an APS diagnosis, should a differential diagnosis for thromboembolism be conducted? Yes. So this is the condition that the panel has mentioned that I discussed previously. A differential diagnosis for thromboembolism should be conducted when a mother has a diagnosis of antiphospholipid syndrome, especially if she presents with any symptoms suggestive of thromboembolic events. And then we see some explanation of this and why it's important, and when you should conduct a differential diagnosis when there are various signs. In such cases, you consider thromboembolism as a likely diagnosis, but also rule out other causes. Again, of course, this doesn't appear to have happened, but when the experts have looked at all the case notes and all the information around these infants, they have concluded that thromboembolism is a likely diagnosis. So then we can move on to this thing, this is another very important point. Can antiphospholipid antibodies be passed on without positive diagnosis? And this is the important part of this. It's not inherited directly like genes, so it's not passed on in the genetic sense, but it can be inherited from the mother. And this was explained to me by an absolutely top geneticist and a microbiologist. So the science around the antibodies was just discounted in court completely, and Professor Sally Kinsey gave this very flippant response, this very flippant notion that they couldn't possibly have been passed on. But it doesn't work like that. It's not passed on in the usual manner of inheritance. It is via this manner of antibodies. It's well established, and that's why you've got people like Professor Carola van Weser talking about these things. That's why people told me this before the panel, cited it. This is well known to be the case, and yet somehow the science in this case failed yet again. So this is another important aspect of it. Is this statement true? It is not common to detect antiphospholipid syndrome antibodies at birth, even in children born to mothers positive for APL during pregnancy. Yes, that statement is generally true. So again, there's the explanation of these substances that antiphospholipid syndrome is associated with. And the explanation that is important here is that these antibodies can cross the placenta, so newborns and mothers with APS or APL can have detectable APL antibodies at birth. However, in most cases, the antibodies found in newborns are passively transferred maternal antibodies, not antibodies produced by the infant themselves. These passively transferred antibodies typically disappear within a few months, although we don't know about that because the testing wasn't done. Again, so all that is very clear. The key thing, as I say, is that this testing that is required by the British Society for Haematology was never done. So why a haematologist stood up in court and stated that, well, she ruled out antiphospholipid syndrome completely, even though it's on the clinical notes for child A, it's on the clinical notes for child B. Lots of people have mentioned it before the panel convened, and then when the panel convened, they cited this. And yet the testing was never done to rule this out, and yet Professor Sally Kinsey gave a very definitive statement on this, which is very difficult to understand because presumably she's associated or affiliated with the British Society for Haematology, who say that her comments in court were essentially factually incorrect. The next thing to mention about child A is that sepsis was present in this infant. This is true of so many of the children in this court case, and this was noted, in fact, by Lucy Letby herself. She also mentioned, I believe in court, that antiphospholipid syndrome was discussed at the hospital, and she also mentioned, which is not contested, that if the death of child A had been established as an air embolism, of course, this wasn't suggested at the time, including by pathologists, then the air embolism must have been caused by the person connecting the fluids, which was not Lucy Letby. So sepsis, just to go back to sepsis briefly, this heightens the susceptibility to everything that we've discussed previously in the video. They say here catheter-related infection. Obviously, we've discussed the numerous catheterizations of this infant. So in terms of what Lucy has said about not being present for the delivery of the connection of the fluids, this brings us back to the Unheard article that has 10 out of 28 incidents that Lucy Letby is not present for. You can see she's not present for some of the infants, for one of the incidents related to child A. She wasn't present when the fluids were connected. So that would cast further doubt on this already extremely shaky conviction of this infant that was showing all kinds of clinical signs. The next point, and this is really the last point that I wanted to raise on this, is that one medic mentioned to me that libido reticularis is a very possible, even likely aspect of this case. This is a skin condition characterized by a net-like or mottled pattern. So we see this description of mottling all the way through the court case and with regard to child A. A mottled pattern of discoloration, often appearing as a reddish blue or purple discoloration on the skin, which was observed in this case, typically on the arms, legs and trunk. It's often caused by reduced blood flow to the skin, which can be due to various factors such as underlying medical conditions. So there's more explanation about libido reticularis. It's important to note that this hasn't been specifically mentioned by the panel in its preview to its report, but it could very well have been mentioned in the final report itself. We simply don't know at this point. And I've asked a little question here about the link between antiphospholipid syndrome and libido reticularis, and it's concluded here that these are closely linked and that libido reticularis can be a clinical clue to suspect antiphospholipid syndrome. Here's how they connect. There's a clear link between them, antiphospholipid syndrome being an autoimmune hypercoagulable disorder characterized by these things that we've already discussed. Libido reticularis is exactly what we just mentioned, this purplish skin discoloration caused by abnormal blood flow. The connection is that the vascular involvement in antiphospholipid syndrome can lead to small and medium-sized vessel thrombosis or vasospasm, which can result in libido reticularis. Libido is seen more often in secondary antiphospholipid syndrome, but can also occur in primary antiphospholipid syndrome. There's something here about its presentation as libido racemosa as well. Clinical significance. Libido reticularis may be one of the earliest visible signs of antiphospholipid syndrome. In a patient with thrombosis or pregnancy loss and libido, testing for antiphospholipid antibodies is warranted. I would say essential. And it just simply did not happen on this unit. But having said that, they did at least recognise this condition. And I say Lucy has mentioned it in court, but persistent libido, especially if atypical, increases suspicion of systemic involvement or catastrophic APS. So I've asked this question, again I need the answer. Can libido reticularis be a marker for predicting multi-system thrombosis in antiphospholipid syndrome? Yes, libido reticularis, a mottled discoloration caused by blood flow changes in the skin, can indeed be a marker for predicting multi-system thrombosis in antiphospholipid syndrome, although it is not always definitive on its own. And then there's some further explanation about this, how it can be predictive, the links between the two, why it's significant in thrombosis. And it was explained to me that this is, libido reticularis is the most common skin problem associated with antiphospholipid syndrome, and that, as mentioned, it's characterized by this mottled patterning. Considering that the clinical notes state the mother had this condition and it was observed in both of the infants, I was told that libido reticularis is a much more likely cause of rashes and discoloration than, well, we can almost entirely rule out the idea that it's maliciously administered air embolism, but this gives a considerably more plausible explanation. There are studies that indicate that libido reticularis affects a large percentage of those that are in possession of antiphospholipid antibodies. And as I've mentioned, the condition is a clear marker for predicting thrombosis, as has been confirmed by many academic reviews, many papers, and more than one medic that I've spoken with, which is why it was so easy to research this topic. When the court proceedings were taking place, a great deal was made of the fact that the staff had never seen any of these rashes or mottling before. But this can, and as in many other cases and with many other phenomena associated with the court case, be explained by the simple lack of experience on the neonatal unit, which is well documented. The fact that external conditions have not been seen previously does not mean that they're suspicious. It doesn't mean that there isn't a good explanation for them, and it definitely doesn't mean that they have to be explained by murder, as Dr. Evans seemed to conclude in every single case. So to summarise this video, we'll begin with discussing something that was the subject of part one, which was that Child A was one of many infants in the Lucy Letby case suffering with a catalogue of serious health conditions from birth. I outlined that in some depth in the previous video. Indeed, the mother of Child A wanted the infant to be born elsewhere, presumably because she knew that the infant needed specialist care that was beyond the capabilities of the neonatal unit at the County to Chester. This is again repeating the pattern that several children in the case almost certainly should have been born on level 3 units, whereas this was a level 2 unit that was then downgraded to being a level 1 unit. Thirlwall lawyers have claimed that comments made by the panel in relation to Child A are known to be incorrect because they were rebuffed by Professor Sally Kinsey in court, and the defence did not contest this. It is true that Professor Sally Kinsey made certain statements in court, but these were not well founded. It is also true that the defence did not specifically challenge these comments in court, but the defence didn't challenge numerous critical statements that are provably incorrect, most notably with regard to the insulin cases. Claims in the case centred around the condition antiphospholipid syndrome, which can cause blood clotting. Clinical notes at the time indicate that both child A and his twin child B were born with antiphospholipid syndrome. This was not doubted, challenged, or questioned in any way at the time. Professor Sally Kinsey, for some reason, very flippantly ruled out the possibility of antiphospholipid syndrome in child A. This is despite the condition being included in the clinical notes at the time. This assertion from Kinsey also, for some reason, does not take into account the fact that 2 blood tests 12 weeks apart are required to rule out this syndrome. We know for a fact that these tests were not conducted. By making this assertion, Kinsey is going against the specific guidelines of the British Society for Haematology. It is important to understand as well that the antiphospholipid antibodies can be passed to an infant via the placenta, which occurs with some regularity when the condition is present in the mother. The genetic propensity for antiphospholipid syndrome in infants with mothers carrying the condition has been discussed by top geneticist Professor Carola van Weesser, amongst others. Indeed, antibodies can be passed on without a positive diagnosis, as has been well documented and as is outlined in this video. When a mother has a diagnosis of antiphospholipid syndrome, it is important for a differential diagnosis of thromboembolism to be conducted, which did not occur in the case of child A. The importance of conditions such as thromboembolism and the likelihood of their involvement in the case of child A was mentioned to me by several medical professionals some months before the panel was even put together. Mottling of the skin reported in the case of child A could be related to livedo reticularis. There is considerable evidence which points to this conclusion. Repeat catheterizations, trauma and sepsis are all likely to have contributed to the clinical outcome of child A. These issues were noted on the unit at the time, and indeed they're well documented and not contested. Lucy Letby was not present when the fluids were introduced for child A, which was mentioned in court, and therefore could not be responsible for a supposed air embolism, even though this spurious diagnosis has been completely disproven anyway. In conclusion, the simplistic assertion made by the Thirlwall lawyers and in the Times article was not factually incorrect, but instead simply demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding and knowledge. So that's the end of the second part of this video, and of the discussion of child A. If you haven't seen the first part, it might be a good idea to go back and watch it. It deals with many of the important aspects of the infant that I've got on the screen currently. The point is that, again, this was a claim made by Thirlwall lawyers and made in the Times article that is at least not factually incorrect. The problem is it displays a fundamental ignorance about what was said in court and about what the panel have said and about the science related to what the panel have said, and indeed the science, the so-called science that was presented in court, which was repeatedly extremely weak or completely flawed. So ultimately, this is another claim that really has no merit, and I think these two videos made that very clear. So this video, I should also mention briefly, I will just mention briefly, that I also discussed child F briefly in the previous video. This was related to the insulin cases. Child F was one of the 2 infants that Lucy Letby was alleged to have poisoned with insulin. Essentially, that is a testing issue, and the assertion made, again, was very poorly founded. But I'm going to deal with that in much more depth in forthcoming videos, because the next series of videos that I'm going to make are going to be on the insulin tests and the insulin cases in general, and all the mistakes that occurred with regards to the insulin cases and all the problems with them, and so on and so forth. I'm going to make one more video on the Thirlwall lawyers' statements at this point in time, and that's going to be on, it's going to be a summary of everything related to the Thirlwall lawyers have said. I'll try to make this in one video, but I might have to break it up into 2 videos. I'm going to try and make videos that are around an hour in length and maybe make them more regularly, rather than making something that's, one of these videos was 2.5 hours, and I feel that's a lot of content to ask people to watch. So I'll try and break them down into smaller chunks so they're more digestible. With this in mind, I said that I was considering making a video of all the parts joined together. I think that's a bit excessive because it would be like 9 hours or something, and I just can't ask someone to sit and watch 9 hours. Why would they do that? So I won't do that. What I'm going to do instead is do a summary video and then create a playlist for this issue, and then we're going to move on to doing many other issues in depth as well. The insulin cases, going to be looking at the court transcripts, going to be looking at the Court of Appeal verdicts. I'll be looking at the embolism cases and many other things as well, possibly the Operation Hummingbird documentary in depth, and many other subjects as well. And it's going to be the way that this video was done, as forensically as possible. I'll put as many parts together as it requires. And I realised that having done a lot of research on this subject and also having had researchers working with me, which is a great privilege, and I must emphasise that while I do have a very good background knowledge of this case and I've done a lot of research myself, some of the arguments made in these videos, well, I think I've made it clear as well. Some of the arguments are coming from healthcare professionals. A lot of them are coming from healthcare professionals, and then I've done research to back this up as well. Everything that I've written in my book, when it comes out, has been fact-checked by medics, by professionals, by scientists, by relevant people, to make sure that I haven't made any mistakes, because inevitably I will make mistakes, and I'm sure some will slip through the net, but we've done the best job that we possibly can of dealing with that. What the original point I was going to make was that some of the research in these videos has come from my researchers, particularly my main researcher, whose name I won't mention at the moment, but her name will definitely be credited for the work that she's done, because it's been absolutely brilliant. So I just wanted to make that clear and give credit where credit is due. Obviously, I've done a lot of research as well, but it's been a team effort to get to this point, and some of the information in this video has not come from me, or quite a significant portion, I would say, between the interviews that I've done with healthcare professionals and between the research that has been handed to me. This is not all coming from my brain. My brain has to put it together in a form that you can understand. Hopefully I can do that. I have faith in my writing ability in particular. So I think people will enjoy reading the book when it comes out. And I will update people because people have asked questions about it. I can't reveal everything about it at this point in time. I will update people as and when it's relevant. I just realised that I could do some videos. Initially, I was going to do one video on the Thirlwall lawyer statement because I just felt that had to be responded to, as it was so just egregiously poor and misleading. I would say deliberately misleading. Whether or not they would accept that, I doubt they would. But certainly there are some very poorly founded claims on there. But I realised that I can do stuff that other people haven't done, and I can't do audiovisual stuff at any particularly impressive level, but I can do these kind of forensic analyses of things. So that's pretty much the end of the Thirlwall lawyer statements, except the summary video. So really appreciate all the support. As always, if you have any comments, queries, questions, or corrections, always corrections, because I will correct anything that I get wrong, or any little suggestions that people have, or things that could be added to what I've said, I would really appreciate. So thanks again, and I'll be posting another video within the next 2 to 3 days.